Hi, everybody. I thought I'd try being a creepy clown today on a roller coaster. Here we go. All right. This is going to be scary. Was that the dumbest thing ever? Good. Anyway, I wanted to see how creepy I would be. Some of you thought maybe a clown was a great example of the uncanny valley, and I think for a lot of people it is. And I think this clown is especially uncanny, if I can say so myself. So, hope you're all doing well. A couple of things I wanted to talk about before we start today's lecture. First of all, you will have discussion section on Monday. Of course, we're going to use the full session because we had a miss one last week. There won't be any review, which is fine probably because you probably won't have studied yet. So we are going to move a review session to the Monday right before your test. Your test is on Tuesday, a week from Tuesday, and you'll be given the entire 80-minute period. Anytime you want to take the test, it's the same type of thing as last time. Monday, I don't know when they have scheduled the review session. I think the TAs are still talking about a good time that they all can be there. And regardless, it will be recorded. And you will get that information. They'll probably tell you in section this coming Monday. So we have section on Monday, and then a week from Monday, we will have a review session that the TAs are going to put on for you, which will prepare you for your test, which will be a week from this coming Tuesday. Okay? I think that's pretty clear enough. I don't think I need to take questions at this point. We'll start taking questions about the exam next week. Okay, so what we're going to do is start discussing other aspects of faces. So remember the big story in faces. The big story in faces is, hey, let me know if this is getting you seasick. I kind of thought that this roller coaster would be a kind of fun sort of distraction and maybe keep you more engaged in the lecture, because I know a lot of you like the more dynamic sorts of backgrounds, but let me know if it gets you seasick and I will change it to something more serene. But anyway, the big question with faces is why is it that we're so sensitive? And it seems that that was kind of the basis for the uncanny valley. Again, you don't get uncanny valley sort of phenomena when you're looking at non-human faces or non-human bodies or anything like that. It does seem to be something that is specific to humans and to human faces most particularly. Why is that the case? And then we made the argument that there is nothing in our perceptual world that communicates information to us so quickly and so efficiently and so robustly as a human face. And so it pays for us to have evolved a brain that is sensitive to human faces and all the nuances that human faces convey to us. Nuances in, of course, expression, nuances about age, information about gender and potential sexual compatibility, things like that. This has, again, evolved a brain that makes us especially sensitive to faces. And we talked about some of the ways that we are especially sensitive to faces, many of which included experiments that demonstrated that we don't need to be consciously aware that we're looking at a face for faces to still have some, influences over our behavior in experiments, right? So our brain processes face information, even if our conscious awareness isn't in touch with seeing faces, doesn't know that we're seeing faces. And we saw that in the context of facial expression and recognition of famous versus infamous people, that sort of thing. So we're going to continue on this discussion. And let's just remind us where we left off last time. Oh, here, before I do that, let me change my clowny face. I think you'd probably get sick of that after a while. Okay. Or maybe you prefer the clowny face. I know I do. And my wife does, as it turns out. Anyway, let's go ahead and continue discussing faces. And just a couple more adjustments here. Good. So we left off talking about facial expression. Oops, sorry. Yeah, hold on just a second. There we go. Yes, we left off talking about facial expression, and discussed not only the fact that we can perceive facial expression unconsciously, meaning that we don't again need to be aware of seeing a face for it to be processed by our brain and have some subtle influences on us. But then we also talked about another unconscious aspect of face and expression perception having to do with how it affects our own expressions. So the way to think about this, the way to remember this, I think, is to remember that your teachers and your parents told you when you were little, smile and the whole world smiles back. Well, it's true that this does occur, and it occurs on an unconscious level most of the time. So even if you're just sitting at a computer in an experiment where you're asked to do something kind of distracting, like judge the face's age or something like that, when you would see a smiling face in that context, you would have a very subtle smile response. And that smile response would be, this sort of smile you might recognize. Oops, sorry. Yeah, right here. Okay, you can see she's smiling a little bit more than here, and that's because she's just looking at a computer screen that just showed her a smiley face. She would be probably very unaware that she was smiling. And sometimes it's even more subtle than that. You can't see it with the naked eye. You have to measure this using what's called, well, I won't get into the technical name, but it just measures muscle activity underneath the skin. And there are, I guess, imitative actions that are done with the face unconsciously, depending on the expression you're looking at. This can also be subliminally induced. In other words, you can have these very subtle reactions to expressive faces, even if the faces are shown so quickly to us, we're not consciously aware that they are there. And then finally, we talked about these subtle effects, but they are measurable, so I thought I would mention them. It does seem to, looking at a smiling face, even when it is presented so quickly we are unaware of seeing it, it can have a very, very small effect on some people's moods. Very small, and it's not long lasting. So, if somebody is selling something on the internet, say, hey, we're going to make you happy by having you look at subliminal happy faces, chances are it's not worth the money, but there can be small effects here and there. And it's interesting to think about nonetheless, which might have something to do with the fact that our own smiles, maybe our smile reactions, as well as looking at faces, do have these subtle influences on our mood. This is not without controversy. Again, it's a very subtle effect if it exists at all, but it's still an interesting sort of finding. Okay, we're going to move on with our discussion of faces and start talking about whether we can perceive personality from faces. And, I know that you're thinking, well, I shouldn't judge a book by its cover, right? I look at somebody, in a coffee shop or in the grocery store, and I say, well, that person, just by looking at their face, I can tell that person has this type of personality. That's a grumpy person. That's an angry person. That's a happy person. That's an easygoing person. Even if they're not smiling, even if they're not frowning, even if their face is just, in its neutral position, we kind of feel like we can tell something about a person by looking at their face. I'm going to tell you the truth. Okay? We can. Just a little bit, though, before, you say, oh, Mom, you know what you told me about not judging a book by its cover, not making, kind of judgments on people before we get to know them. There's actually something interesting here, that there is something that we can tell about a face, but it is very subtle again. Oops, I forgot to turn on one of my lights. This might help see me, like you want to see me even more. Just take a second. Is that better? Oh, there I go. Gosh. Now you can see every flaw. Anyway, hey, look at that. I'm losing my hair. Anyway, speaking of faces, there is something you can tell. It's very subtle, and your parents are right. Don't judge a face. Don't judge a person by its face. There's a lot more we need to understand, but there is some degree to which we can do it, which is just interesting in and of itself. Well, when you look at somebody, and I look at these two women here, and if I asked you which of these two women might have had an easier life, might have had a happier life, maybe have a more easygoing disposition, which one would you say? Would you say that this person here on the left, this woman here on the left of the screen, is somebody who has an easier disposition, maybe a more easygoing, or this person here on the right? I think most people would say the person on the left might have an easier disposition, maybe a little bit easier, more easygoing, maybe more pleasant to be around than the person on the right. I think that's generally what people say when I show them these pictures. Well, as it turns out, this is my mom right here. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. My mom had a very easy disposition, and she was a very smiley, sweet person, so that is not my mom. But it's interesting that we can still have a sense of what that personality might be like. People have different opinions. Maybe some of you thought that this face was of a more easygoing person, but it's interesting that we can form opinions, and we form opinions really, really quickly. So we can't help it. We look at a face and we feel like we can judge something about the person, even if the person isn't smiling or frowning, but just kind of posing a neutral expression, as these two women are right here, which is interesting. And we seem to do it very, very quickly. And so, it's a sort of experiment where you're shown a face like this woman up here, and you're asked to just maybe press one of two buttons. Is this a pleasant or less pleasant person? Something like that. I mean, it's forcing you into to make a quick judgment. It's forcing you into judging a book by its cover sort of decision. But what's interesting is after we make that judgment, we'll stick to that judgment for a long time. So maybe if you're shown that picture again in a week and asked to do the same thing, or asked to now look at it for a very long time, we'll be pretty consistent with our initial impressions. That doesn't mean we're correct, okay? Not yet. Doesn't mean we're correct, but it does mean that our impressions of people by their faces is formed quickly, and it turns out to be pretty consistent after that. Well, before we get into whether or not this is true, whether or not we are good at judging people by their faces, okay, why might that be the case? All right, well, let's think about what goes into shaping a face. All right, so this is going to seem kind of an interesting, a kind of different sort of take on what happens with faces as faces go through time. You've probably heard the old adage that a person's life is written on their face, especially as they get older. And the idea is that, you can look at a person's wrinkles, you can look at a person's maybe, the way their face is shaped around their eyes, and tell something about whether the person has had a hard or easy life to some degree, right? To be kind of, just very, kind of superficial about this, maybe the amount of wrinkles might tell you something about whether the person's done a lot of worrying in their life. Maybe the shape of their cheeks might tell you something about whether that person's done a lot of smiling in their life. And what's interesting about this is it's not a bad idea, because our faces go through exercise. Our faces are really, in some ways, covering for the muscles that are underneath. And just like, if you lift weights, hopefully you guys are figuring out ways of working out there at home. And what we did here, my boys wanted to exercise at home, since we couldn't go to school or the gym or whatever. So we got some of those big rubber band things. And actually, they look silly, but they kind of work well. So probably you're doing something at home too. And if you exercise a muscle, it changes its shape. Right, especially you folks who are young, and it's you can really kind of show fast results if you start exercising, start doing curls. You can really kind of build up the bicep quickly. But that's the way to think about faces. Okay, that faces are reflecting the exercise that's gone on underneath with those muscles. And what induces exercise? Well, what induces exercise is doing the same action over and over again. So in a way, the more you smile, the more your smile muscles kind of get exercise and get larger. Okay. We'll talk about some of the details in just a second, but imagine now, there's different things that can come into play. That we'll talk about that in a second. But imagine now that you're born with the sort of face, I don't know, maybe there's something around your eyes, or there's something when you're a young child that looks sad. You know, maybe you've heard these terrible terms, you know, resting whatever face, that sort of thing. And you know, people who are actually very kind of pleasantly disposed, they have nice personalities, have just the sort of face that looks like when they're resting, that they're complaining, or they're you know, unhappy for some reason. And if that happens, if people approach you based on the type of face you have, they're going to be giving you this sort of social feedback that might kind of reinforce that. And that's called a self-fulfilling prophecy sort of idea, that you're born with a certain type of face that maybe just looks sad on its own or looks happy on its own. Maybe, you know, you've seen people who always look like they have a smile in their eye, even if they're not necessarily happy. I've known people like that. It's a little you know, strange at first, but you get used to it. But those people that have the smiling eyes are approached by other people in a more kind of positive, lighter way than the person who has kind of naturally sad eyes. And then that kind of social feedback will kind of feed into, maybe to some degree, their disposition and the way they express their face. If people are coming at me because I have laughing eyes all the time and they're coming at me, you know, with a more positive disposition, that's going to affect how my face reacts and shape my face. Okay. And this is what we're talking about. How my face is shaped over time is what we can call expressive habits. Okay, so you know, maybe the feedback I get from other people, as well as how often I laugh, how often I'm frowning, that sort of thing, is going to shape my face over time. So especially with elderly faces, my face shape is going to reflect just a kind of the overall kind of trend of, I guess, moods I've had in my life. Okay, this is a theory. Now I know that this is just, you know, it's kind of speculative in some ways, but it might account for the fact that yes, people can look at faces like this and judge something about a personality. So especially with these older faces, these are just two of a sample of faces of older women. Typically, these experiments use women, but sometimes male faces. But women faces are used more. I mean, we can talk about that later. But in this experiment, it was you know, older women in their 70s, I believe, maybe up to their 80s, and they were asked to both make expressions, smiling expressions, frowning expressions, but also importantly, neutral expressions like you're seeing there on the screen. And then these images were shown to, you know, folks in intro psychology who are asked to rate different personality measures just looking at these faces. And it is a thing that's a little uncomfortable at first, you know, because it kind of goes against what we're taught. I don't want to do this. I don't want to, you know, prejudge somebody before I get to know them. But, you know, as I said, it kind of happens automatically. So you go with that judgment. And the question is, are they accurate? And believe it or not, they're more accurate than you would think. Because these women not only had their pictures taken, they also had personality personality questionnaires given to them. So these women would fill out, you know, personality questionnaires, and there's so many different types. I don't remember what was used here, but questions like, I find myself making lots of jokes. I find myself worrying a lot. I have had many hardships in my life. I've had many pleasures in my life, that sort of thing. And that can help, you know, kind of zero in on the type of personality a person has. And the question is whether those personality measures then correlate with the observer's judgments of personality based on their face. And the truth is, yeah, it can. To some small degree. Don't get me wrong. I don't want people to worry. So like they'll look in the mirrors later and say, "Oh, I have one of those resting, you know, faces." You know, that's going to mean that I have this sort of, you know, personality, and this is how people are going to approach me. We're looking at giant data sets, so we can find if there's any trends here at all, and there are that, even though there's so many deviations that we can think of, when you look across lots and lots of faces with lots and lots of subjects, you do see a correlation between how people judge personality from faces and those faces' personalities themselves. Okay, so it's an interesting finding. Even more interesting, I think, though, is that this is not just true of elderly faces. I think when we look at elderly faces, it's almost as if we have a better intuition that we can judge personality from faces based on structure of the faces and that sort of thing. However, it also does work with younger faces. And let me do this demonstration, okay? The demonstration is going to involve this. You're going to see pairs of faces, just like I showed you by mistake. And I'm going to ask you I'm going to ask you questions about the two faces in each slide. I'm going to ask you whether the face you see on the left better fits the description you'll see on top, or the face you see on the right better fits the description on top. And if you're taking notes, you can just write L or R as you go through each of these faces, okay? So it's very simple. I'll just talk you through the first one. So out of these two faces that you're looking at, which would you say is the most agreeable? Is it the person on the left or the person on the right? And you can just go ahead and write L and R in your notebook or on your computer or whatever, just so you remember, okay? We're going to go through about 6 of these. All right, another woman. Which one is more conscientious, the person on the left or the person on the right? Person on the left or the person on the right? Who's more conscientious, L or R? Okay. Who's more extroverted? Who do you think would be, more likely to, be chatty at a party, that, might approach you at a party, that sort of thing? The person on the left or the person on the right? Okay. Who's more neurotic, left or right? Does the person on the right worry more or the person on the left worry more? Left or right? Okay. What you're doing now is you're looking at my face to compare to their faces, because I'm really neurotic. I'm a Jewish psychology professor, I fit the description. Who's more adventurous? Okay, who's more likely to, try new things, be willing to kind of, think out of the box and do things they haven't done before? Is it the person on the left or the person on the right? And then finally, this next one was part of the experiment. Who is more open to casual sex? Who would be more likely to, be laid back about sexual encounters? Okay, the person on the left or the person on the right? Which do you think? Okay, well, let's see how you did. As it turns out, so these are younger faces. Here are the faces that you saw, and there's also a group of male faces there if you want to compare it to see if this is as easy with male faces or are female faces easier for this sort of task. You might have also recognized the questions that I was asking, not the last one, but the first 5 questions about agreeableness and conscientiousness and extroversion, neuroticism, open to new experiences. If you've taken a personality psychology course or maybe, sometimes these sort of questions are asked in the back of magazines to find out your own personality. This is part of a very, very well-known personality profile called the Big 5. So these are considered kind of the Big 5 personality characteristics that can, identify a person as having a particular type of personality. And here's what happened. In the little demonstration that you just performed, the answers were, or should have been, left for every single dimension. So most people say that out of these women, these are the women we just judged, this is the one that's more agreeable, this is the one that's more conscientious, this is the one that's more extroverted, neurotic, and open to new experiences. Okay. So what does this mean? Oh, yeah, by the way, also true of sexual openness. Yeah, I'm pretty sure she was the one that would be the correct answer for sexual openness. Okay. So what does this do? How does this experiment work? How, I mean, you determined right away, you looked at these first two faces and thought, oh my gosh, these are very similar faces. There's very little to distinguish these faces, right? But there's differences. How were the faces made? And this is such an interesting way to do the experiment. I could imagine that you'll hear about how this was done, and you'll think about different, kind of ways of using this method to test other things. 100 women were brought into the lab, okay? And they had their pictures taken. They had their pictures taken, in a very kind of standard way. So they, all the faces were the same. When the pictures were taken, all the face images were the same size. All the eyes were lined up and all that sort of thing. And they also filled out this Big Five questionnaire that identified their characteristics, okay? And then, this is really clever, they took the 100 subjects and looked at the dimension of, say, let's go with conscientiousness. That's a really easy one to understand, okay? And, based on a whole bunch of questions, they were able to determine the 10 of the 100 that were the most conscientious, okay, and the 10 of the 100 that were the least conscientious, okay? So they wanted the extremes, okay? So the 10 most conscientious and the 10 least conscientious, and they're gonna just, for this part of the stimulus creation, they're gonna leave out the 80 remaining faces for this. So they take the 10 faces that are most, of people that are rated as most conscientious, and they superimpose them on each other to basically create, I guess in some sort of Photoshop type of application, they're able to create the average face of the most conscientious person. And that's what you're looking at here. The average face of the 10 most conscientious people in the study they were conducting. And of course, they also were able to add the faces together for the 10 least conscientious people that they had tested. And so they have the extremes. Out of the 100 faces they used, they had the extremes. They had a face that represented, or that was kind of a creation out of the 10 most conscientious and 10 least conscientious, and they showed these pictures to people, now naive subjects who came in like you and judged conscientiousness. And in fact, what they found was people could do this. Not for everything. I should be very careful here. I think it did for women. It worked for all 6 of these dimensions. And it worked better, interestingly, when women were the judges, when women were the ones that looked at the faces, okay? So women's faces were more effective than men's faces. Men's faces were more difficult for people to do. And I think for a lot of these men's faces distinctions, people just couldn't do it at all. They were like at chance levels. But for women's faces, when women's faces were shown to subjects, and the subjects themselves were women who seemed to be a little bit more sensitive to these things, there was this effect that they were able to judge what was the composite of the most conscientious face and the least conscientious face. And that was true, I think, for every single dimension here. It wasn't true with male faces. It wasn't as true if men were the subjects in judging the faces, but it did work, okay? Which is pretty interesting. I know there's a lot of questions popping up. I knew there would be. I think it's really interesting research. I think it really kind of feeds into the idea that we are so sensitive to faces, that it really kind of shows, that we have a brain that's really trying to get as much facial information as possible. Even if we're kind of told not to do it, we can pick out certain aspects of personality, it looks like, at least in certain conditions. Okay. Again, there's so many deviations, but the fact that we can do it at all is really kind of interesting. It might have to do with what we were discussing before. Like, yes, these are not elderly faces. These are faces of adults, but these young adults, okay? These are probably faces of people somewhere between 18 and 21. But those faces have also gone through the kind of exercise, kind of the expressive habits that faces do as they are, having experiences in the world. The researchers don't know what dimensions of the face. So what are people looking at here? I don't think, I kind of keep my eye on this research since I wrote the book, and I don't think that we know very much about what the important parts of the face are that signal things like conscientiousness. So, I mean, is it around the eyes? Is it around the mouth? Open to new experiences? I don't know, is it around the mouth more than the eyes? What's the important thing? I don't think scientists know this. That's okay. You guys can figure it out if you decide to, become psychology researchers. It's a great question, right? But still, the fact that you see these trends and people are able to do it at least to some degree is really interesting. Is it based on these kind of expressive habits, the way the face is exercised and how that changes the nature of the face, perhaps? Okay. It might have something to do with the self-fulfilling prophecy idea as well. So if somebody is born with a worried look in their eye, and they're maybe asked by their parents and their relatives and their friends, how come you always look so nervous? Even though maybe at first they weren't, maybe they grew into a nervous person. All of these things might play a role. We just don't know. But we do know that there is some ability to judge some things about a personality, at least with these extreme individuals, just by looking at a neutral face. Okay, a couple of other things I just wanted to mention in this slide, then we'll take your questions. I can see all of them popping up. It's an interesting topic, I know. Spouses. Okay, so this is interesting too. We probably know spouses that look like each other, that we say, oh my gosh, of course they're married, they look just like each other. And there's a lot of things that could play a role in that, right? So this couple, oh my gosh, they could be brother and sister. I mean, really, in a way, I've certainly seen spouses that you could say, they look so much alike. Are they spouses? Are they siblings, right? I've certainly seen that, and you see that sometimes as people get older. They tend to look, so much like each other, which is interesting. My parents facially looked a little bit like each other. Actually, my dad was 6 feet tall. My mom was 5'3" or 2 or something like that. So bodily they look very, very different, but their faces, you would say, yeah, I could imagine these people were married a long time, 50 some years. And we've seen that in lots of elderly faces. And there could be lots of reasons why people in long-term relationships look like each other. First is maybe the most intuitive one that you might have noticed, and that is that people do, because of their cultural experience, do tend to often marry people that are from their same culture, right? If you grew up, in a New York Jewish culture like I did, there's a good chance, someone like me might marry somebody else from that culture. I didn't, but there's a lot of people who did, and that could obviously play a role in how people kind of look like each other. But there's something else that goes on, and we know this for a fact because what you can do is you can look at the couple at the age of marriage, because everyone's got lots of wedding pictures, and then you can take pictures of them again. And again, when they got married at first, they might have looked like each other because of the kind of cultural similarities and that sort of thing, the ethnicity. I'm sorry, yeah, the ethnic similarities are really what I'm saying. But did they grow to look more like each other over time? If you then took the pictures from their 50th wedding anniversary, would they look more like each other? And what you find is this, I think this is really interesting, that yes, for a lot of couples, when you look at their 30th, 40th, 50th anniversary, when you take pictures of them, they do tend to look more like each other in many cases than they did when they started out. So they do converge. A lot of couples do converge in facial appearance. And what you also find is the degree to which they converge has something to do with the nature of the relationship itself. Specifically, they'll give these older couples questionnaires about the kind of the mutual empathy that occurs in the relationship. How often, when you folks are dealing with issues at work or with friends, do you sit down and talk to each other and support each other in doing it? So the empathy that's in the relationship, and there's lots of ways personality psychologists have it at measuring that sort of thing. And depending on how much empathy is determined to be in the relationship from these questionnaire measures, that will predict how much the spouses converged in facial appearance. Unsurprisingly, the more empathy in the relationship, the more convergence occurs on the faces, the more they look like each other over time. What's that about? Well, it could be about a lot of things. They share a lot more time together if they're in a healthy, empathetic relationship. and lots of things that they go through together, can play a role in how they ultimately look, including, the diets they have, and if they spend a lot of time outside versus inside, all those sort of things. But the fact that it's the empathy probably has also to do with the fact that they're sharing emotions and the expressions that come along with those emotions. And in doing so, again, they're sharing expressive habits. They're sharing the exercise that faces go through when they smile again and again and again, or they have a more sullen expression again and again and again. And that shapes the way our faces look. If the spouses are going through similar emotions, a comparable amount of time, that could shape the faces in the same way, so they grow to look like each other. Okay, interesting stuff, huh? Let's take our little break here and look at some questions. Okay, here we go. Aida asked, no, the review session is a week from Monday, Aida. Alex, so is this why we feel like clowns are uncanny, since their makeup hides their expression? Oh, locks it into so. That's a good question, Alex. So before, I can't remember if Alex asked this question or other folks asked this, or somebody else asked this question. Are clowns a good example of the uncanny valley experience? And we thought maybe for some of us, it in fact could be. And now Alex is asking, does that have to do with expression, that the clown makeup sometimes shows them as happy when in fact they're not happy? Let's try that. Now you see, let's do a little experiment for ourselves right here. So yeah, cool. Let's take a look at this. All right, so that clown is in a happy face. So if I look sad, I don't know, I still look happy, don't I? I mean, my eyes sad, so yeah, okay, that's no question. My eyes look happy there, but if I have sad eyes, yeah, that is a little disarming, isn't it, Alex? That's a really interesting question, and we can demonstrate it here at the amusement park on the roller coaster. Yeah, that is weird. My eyes look sad and my mouth looks happy. Interesting. Cool. Maybe that is it. Maybe that does have something to do with the, here I'm going to continue with this through the discussion, I think. Maybe that does have to do, that might tap into the uncanny valley. So that's not right. So, one of the things about the uncanny valley is you got to get everything right. So if the face shows it's smiling in one part, but not in the other part, that might make it uncanny. That's a great idea, Alex. That's a really, really interesting idea. Ayana asks, is that why people like watching others when they give them a gift, because they're looking for that happy reaction that in turn makes them smile? So you're talking about the smiles that go back and forth between people. Very, very good question. Yeah, I would not be surprised. And we all get satisfaction from giving somebody a present they really, really like. Then there's a, here you go, and there's a smile there, and then it makes you smile, and that is, there's both the sharing of emotion and the sharing of expression. So yeah, I'm sure that's part of it. And it probably does play a role in the experience one has as the giver in the happiness. Cool. Is smiling also due to smiling? For example, if someone smiles at you, you would have a smiling face. Not that you are smiling, but it is caused by the subliminal smile of the person that you're talking to. So I think what you're saying, Aida, is that when you see somebody, when you're not necessarily consciously aware of somebody smiling because the smile is either very quick or it's very subtle, might that actually have a bearing on your smile? And yeah, it probably does. We do know that expressions can be processed by the brain even if we're not consciously aware of those expressions. And we do know that there's a reactive, kind of an imitative, very subtle smile that goes on when we're seeing these smiles presented to us at an unconscious level. Really cool questions. Faye asks, could they not do eye tracking on participants to see what they are? Oh, great question. Okay, see, this is your dissertation, Faye, if I'm pronouncing it right. So when I mentioned that I don't think scientists know what parts of the face are conveying personality traits, these big 5 traits. Yes, I think that's a really interesting question to technically sort that out. And yeah, that's the way to do it, right? I mean, that's the way we do things like that in our lab when we study face perception to some degree, not like expression perception, but we study face perception when it comes to using the face for speech perception purposes. And what we will do is we will either, track the eye movements, which can be useful in many cases, or you just do this. You just, kind of show up parts of the face a little bit at a time. So if we did that previous experiment, but, just showed the eyes from those images, could people still do it? Or just showed the mouth from those images, could people still do it? So yeah, there's lots of ways of doing that, and that's your dissertation. Yeah, you'd ask about the exam again. So it's on, I think June 2nd is the right date, Tuesday, June 2nd. I'll confirm that next week, I promise. But, you can look it up, and it will tell you on whatever that is called, the thing where you can look at your classes and all that sort of stuff. But do we have other questions about faces right now? Other questions about face perception? I know that people find this really interesting. I do. I mean, I love faces. I've always loved faces. I'm one of those folks. I think that we have different levels of how well we can recognize faces. So we talked about prosopagnostics, who really don't have at least conscious awareness of recognizing a face. They'll see pictures and say, "I have no idea who that is." And what we know is that it's not like you're either prosopagnostics or you're not. There's actually some bit of a gradient. I mean, prosopagnostics are, they have to really struggle and they have to find other ways. But then there's a range where people are better or worse at recognizing faces. And I as I speak to you as a clown, I think I've always been better. Like, I'm the one in the coffee shop or the restaurant who always recognizes the celebrity first. I don't know how you folks are like this. You're in Southern California, you go to Los Angeles, and you know this, that some people are good at recognizing celebrities and some people are terrible. And I'm one of these folks that's really, really good. I'm not looking for them, but it was just like click, and there, it will be like, oh, there's Julia Roberts, there's Dustin Hoffman, that sort of thing. And I have a very good memory for faces. I can even match the face to the context. Usually, I'm not great with names at all, but I just, based partly on what seems like a little bit of an aptitude for it, I've always been interested in faces, and it's one of the reasons why we do study faces in my lab, which we'll be talking about next week. Aida, we will learn about facial inversion in about 30 seconds. Chelsea, is there some basis for when we assume someone's voice based on their face? Oh, Chelsea, you're making my heart flutter. That is research that we have conducted in my lab, and of course has been conducted in other labs, and I am so excited to talk to you about that next week. Very good question, Chelsea. It's the relationship between faces and voices. So do I look like right now my voice matches my face? Yeah, I would say so. Okay, I'm going to be a sad clown again. That is weird. That's a weird thing, Alex. That's really weird. Okay, let's do a question for fun. All right, let's see here. Yeah, let's just go to this one. This one has to do with how different expressions occur in different cultures. So the question is this: different cultures, A, interpret the 7 core facial expressions in exactly the same way. B, have different display rules for facial expressions. C, all produce their facial expressions with the same degrees of exaggeration. Or D, all of the above. Read the question carefully. I decided to add this question to our poll today because it is a tiny bit trickier than you would expect based on the concept. So read the answers carefully, because there's some answers that are clearly, well, okay, just read carefully. I don't want to give away too much. Yeah, good. Can you guys change your answers after you make an answer? I'm just curious. Someone just write yes or no whether you can change your answer as the poll is going on. No. Oh my gosh, Elizabeth, I'm sorry. Which is a good reason to take your time. Okay, this was tricky. I'm really glad I asked this. I'm really glad I asked this. You know, and you know what I'm going to do while you guys are finishing this up? I'm sorry, I'm going to take my clowny face off. How can you learn from a clown? All right. Okay, just a few more seconds on the question. Okay, cool. So we'll end the poll here. Okay. And I will share the results so you can see what most people said and what the right answer is. As you can see, this was a tough one. This was probably the toughest question we had in terms of how people answered it. So this is about facial displays, which we talked about last class. And remember what we said about facial displays. Remember we said that originally, okay, there was this idea that every culture had the same expressions, right? But then we decided that as research went on, that was not the case. That what really was distinguished here was the differences between positive and negative expressions, where there would be some kind of mix-up that would go on within the negative faces if you tested them in America versus Papua New Guinea or some parts of rural Africa that didn't have access to Western media or something like that. So it is not the case that they interpret the 7 core expressions in exactly the same way. So that answer is not correct, right? In fact, they don't. They might maybe smiles, but they do have different interpretations of what we would call an angry face. Other people might say that's a sad face, depending on where they're from, that sort of thing. So answer A is incorrect. Have different display rules for facial expressions. That is exactly correct. And the example you can remember that I gave is that I noticed when I was in London that people have very kind of constrained smiles. When I then visited rural England, people had more broad smiles. Right. So what they're expressing, happiness, sadness, but the degree of smile, the exaggeration of that smile is going to be different, which then makes C incorrect. All produce their facial expressions with the same degree of exaggeration. Very few of you answered that. That we know is not true because the display rules say exactly the opposite of that. And my example gives exactly the opposite of that. And so it's not all of the above because A and C are incorrect. The correct answer is B in this case. And I know what you're thinking. Oh, Rosenblum always likes to give those all the above sort of answers, but yeah, right. And I do, because I want to make sure you're learning all those things in testing that in one question. But I'm going to throw questions in there that have all of the above as a possible answer and are not all of the above. So the answer for that one is B. Okay, great. Let's see if there. Oh, I have another question for you. Oh, you have questions for me. One more question. Benjamin asks, what exactly is it that humans tend to focus on when identifying faces? I read somewhere that the uncanny valley happens when the lips move irregularly or when pores don't stretch with muscles. That's a really, really good question. So it depends. So when you said identifying, at first I thought you meant like recognizing Sandra Bullock and Julia Roberts. Hopefully, folks know who they are. People, actors your age. But that's not what you mean. You mean like trying to identify the uncanny valley and whether that affects us. And I think you're absolutely right. These sort of things that you listed. So the lips don't move in the right way or pores don't stretch with muscles. That's great. So like the little dots. I mean, that's such a subtle thing. That's a great example, Benjamin, because it's such a subtle thing that the little pores don't move in the right way as the skin moves. That's enough for us to say, that's that icky face again. There's that uncanny valley is hitting me, and I feel kind of a little disgusted by that because it looks more like a dead person than a live person. So yeah, it's a great example. All of these things, the wetness in the eyes I've discussed, all of these things are really important. Okay, be honest. Should I get rid of this roller coaster? Is it making you nauseous? Yes, no. Yes, I should keep it. No, I should change it. I want to make sure no one's getting sick. Yes, no? Anybody? No one cares that much? Nah, no change. Okay, good, fine. All right, this is interesting. I always thought the more calm, the better, but it could be that the more stimulating, the more engaged you are. So they're going to get more and more dangerous. My backgrounds will get more and more dangerous as the quarter finishes up. Okay, Let's finish up our discussion of face perception. Actually, we're going to do two things here. I am going to skip I'm going to skip talking about a slide because I want to make sure that I get a lot of information in the last few classes. So I'm going to show you which slide I'm going to skip. You're going to be responsible. It's in the book. It's a very simple slide. I'll show you in a second. You got a good slide right before that. So we just talked about, we left off talking about the fact that spouses converge. So here's a question everybody always asks after I talk about spousal convergence, and it has to do with pet convergence. Okay, I have not kept up on the literature that tests whether we grow to look like our dogs. I don't know that. I don't know the answer. I know some of you might be really interested in that sort of thing. The last time I looked at it was 2015, and there was no clear evidence that we either grow to look like our dogs or choose dogs that look like us. Okay, there's nothing confirmatory about that as of 2015. Maybe there's something since then. It's been 5 years. I look at a lot of literature, but I haven't looked at the doggy face literature. What they did know at that time, though, is that you can look at a dog and see a picture of a dog and see a picture of an owner taken, say, at a doggy park, and you see these individuals separately, and match the doggy to the person, but it doesn't seem that that match has anything to do with the doggy's face or the doggy's appearance necessarily, and the person's, kind of the commonality, the similarity in appearances. It's just like, and you can imagine this person is the type of person, given, their face, given maybe their hair, this person looks like the type of person that might own a Bichon Frise, right? Those little puffy doggies. This is the type of person that might own a golden retriever. This is the person that might own a pit bull, that sort of thing. And so people are able to make those sort of matches at better than chance levels, but it doesn't seem to be anything to do, at least at that point, anything to do with the commonality in the appearance between the dog and the person. Okay. If you're interested in that sort of thing, you can look up the literature. There could be new, and I'd be happy if you look it up and you find something new. Let me know. I think my dog is much better looking than me. Okay, but anyway, we can discuss that if you're interested in it on your own. Okay, but what I would like to talk about very quickly is this slide, which I'm just going to release all of it for you. It's online. It's all there. It's just about how we develop face perception. And as you can see, don't write this down now. You've got a copy of the slide. You can look at the video if you want. It just lists how quickly we're able to use facial information. And it is very, very quickly. Certainly within 1 to 3 months, our vision at that point, it still isn't great, but then we are able to recognize even our parents, and we're able to attend to faces, recognize what a face is. We seem to be more interested in faces at a very, very young age. So I'm going to skip that. And instead, I'm going to be talking now about the sort of questions I've been getting from a lot of you, including Aida keeps asking this, so I know she's interested in it. That has to do with the way our brain processes faces and whether we have a special set of brain processes to use when it comes to faces. So again, the big story here is that we are so good at perceiving faces. It seems that we can detect such nuances. We can detect these things with subliminal stimuli that we're not conscious of. They convey so much information. It might make sense for our brain to have a little piece of itself devoted just to faces and to use special processes in that little piece of the brain. Okay. We talked a little bit about this with prosopagnosia, that a person has a brain injury in the fusiform face. It's called the fusiform face area, and they show at least an inability to consciously recognize faces. Does that mean that we have a special part of the brain that's set aside for perceiving faces, and maybe more interestingly, uses a separate set of processes that we don't use for other images, that we don't use when we look at a doggy or we look at a roller coaster or something like that? Do we use special processing to perceive faces? And there, I ask you to look at that face and tell me who it is. You probably by as you've been looking at it, you probably figured it out. It probably didn't take you so long. But what you will notice immediately is that it's so much easier to recognize a person when they are right side up. I mean, that just jumps out at you. You knew exactly who that was immediately when it was right side up. Upside down, it's hard. And this is called the facial inversion effect, okay? That it is disproportionately hard to recognize faces when they are shown to us upside down. What does that mean? That if you take an image of a doggy or an udu, it's not that hard to recognize an udu if you know what it is. When it's upside down, it takes a few milliseconds, but the difference between recognizing the udu upside down versus upright, same with a phone, phone here, yeah, upright. Oh shoot, upright versus upside down, that sort of thing, that's not as disruptive, turning an image of something other than a face upside down. But when you turn the image of a face upside down, it gets basically, what the words I've been using are probably the best, it disproportionately inhibits recognition. Okay, inversion inhibits face recognition disproportionately. What I mean disproportionately, much more than any other type of image. Why is that the case? Well, it's possibly the case is because when we look at upright images of faces, we use special processes that are astonishingly efficient. Okay, so everything I've been talking about with regard to face perception, the subliminal processing of faces, the fact that expressions can kind of influence automatically our reflexive expressions, being able to determine a personality from a face. All of that really is for upright faces. And all of those sorts of things we discussed as so astonishing for faces is true of upright faces. Once we turn a face upside down, we aren't able to achieve those same things. Okay, so it could be that if we do have a special component in our brain that can perceive faces, that can process faces in special ways, like the ways I've mentioned, we're really talking about upright faces. And once you turn a face upside down, it's perceived as anything else, like a beer can. Why is there a beer can here? Because it's part of a magic trick I'm thinking of doing later. It's not that big of a difference when you see it upright or upside down. But when you see a face upside down, it becomes disproportionately harder to perceive because we're so good at upright faces, it seems. Why is that the case? Well, there's a number of different theories about that, but at least one of the theories that continues to be, I think, accepted as part of what's going on is the idea that when we look at an upright face specifically, we're actually doing two types of visual analysis on it. We're doing one where we're looking at the individual features, like the eyes, the mouth, the nose, and one where we're at the same time looking at the relationship between those features. And we call that a configural analysis, or that we're looking at configural information. And all that means is that we look at a face and we identify, so let's talk about Hillary Clinton here. Hopefully you all recognized her. You look at the eyes when you try to recognize Hillary. She has a very distinctive smile. When you look at Hillary, that's probably one of the ways you're able to do that. But in addition to that, when we're looking at upright faces, your memory of Hillary is informed by remembering something about the distance, say, the extent between her eyes and her mouth, between her nose and her chin. And that's different for different people, of course. We all have different facial structures. So when we look at faces, upright faces, we are not just recognizing it by looking at it feature by feature, but we're looking at the features relative to other features, as well as relative to the entire shape of the face. And the idea here is that our ability to recognize, to process upright faces comes from doing this kind of parallel sort of processing of featural and configural information. Okay, so when we look at dogs, when we look at other things like decks of cards, right? We are looking at it, if it's upright or upside down, mostly just by looking at it feature by feature. We don't use the same type of configural information, and if we do, we don't use it with the same efficiency. So what we're saying here is at least one way that upright face perception seems special is through the efficiency with which we can recognize a face using not just featural analysis, not just looking at a feature, not just looking at faces feature by feature, but by the configuration between those features. And that, in fact, might be something specific to faces. So it is not something it's thought to occur with doggies when we look at images of doggies. And in fact, when you're shown different breeds of dogs, your ability to recognize the breed upside down is pretty much as good as your ability to recognize the breed upright. But your ability to recognize Hillary Clinton upside down is nowhere near as fast and as accurate as your ability to recognize Hillary Clinton with her face shown to you upright. So it could be that what makes face perception special is this extra level of processing that involves looking not just at the features, but the relationships between the features. And when you're looking at a person upside down, you can't look at those configural dimensions. You can't do the normal analysis you do with Hillary's face and say, oh yeah, the eyes are so far above the mouth, which is so far above the chin. That gets messed up, much more so, and you can see, much more so than the featural information. I mean, that kind of is still there in a way, but the configural information is pretty much wiped out. So when we invert a picture, the idea is we basically inhibit any sort of analysis we can do of the usual configural information that we do with upright faces. I got a cool example of this. Based on a well-known phenomenon in the face literature, I think you'll find very interesting. It's called the Margaret Thatcher effect. And you might, there was a movie about Margaret Thatcher starring Meryl Streep that came out 10 years ago. I don't know if you've ever seen it, called The Iron Lady, I think, something like that. And she was the prime minister of England during the 80s, around the same time Reagan was president here. Real controversial, very conservative, very controversial figure. But the only reason it's called the Margaret Thatcher effect is because this effect was discovered in the same time she was prime minister, and is kind of a jokey thing. The researchers used the prime minister's face to show the effect, so that's why it's come to be known as the Margaret Thatcher effect. Here is Margaret Thatcher's face shown upside down, and if I asked you which of these two, if I asked you, is there a difference between these two images, you could look at it and say, yeah, I can kind of see a difference now that I look at it feature by feature, right? But if I just take this panel and reverse it so it's upright, look how quickly you are aware of the differences between these two images. Ew. Okay. So this is the real Margaret Thatcher, and this is, no, I'm kidding. This is the real Margaret Thatcher. And this is the Margaret Thatcher picture with two things manipulated. Her eyes have been rotated, and her mouth has been rotated. And it is exactly the same thing you're seeing here, but look at how much easier it is to notice when those images are shown to you upright, okay? And again, the idea here is that we are so sensitive to upright faces that we are able to detect any sort of aberration, any sort of distortion that comes in the face. And by the way, this works not just with rotating features necessarily, but if we elongated her forehead so it was unnaturally long, I mean, she's got a big forehead like me, because we both had two brains. I'm kidding. If it were elongated in kind of an unnatural way using, some sort of picture manipulation, and then the eyes and mouth were the same, it would be the same sort of thing. So it doesn't have to involve rotation of the eyes or mouth. It has to be any distortion. And unsurprisingly, you could infer that, yes, the uncanny valley phenomenon is much more pronounced with inverted faces. So actually, that's something I probably should add to the next slide. We should go back to the original images of the Polar Express and see if they look as icky inverted as they do right side up. You know, you can go back to those slides right now and turn your computer over if you want, but I bet you they're going to seem so much ickier when they're upright. And that comes partly from the fact that your brain, it's thought, is doing this kind of parallel analysis where you're looking at both the features one by one to recognize the face, to analyze the face, and the configuration between the features to do that. And that's what's thought to occur. So that might make faces special. That might be why we seem to have this ability to process faces so quickly, subliminally, and induce these kind of reactive responses and pick out personality. It could have at least partly to do with the fact that there is this kind of dual analysis on faces. So before I leave this, though, I'm going to be quite honest with you and say that story has been changing a little bit. It's been changing because it turns out this special analysis might not just be reserved for faces in certain situations. In fact, let's talk about that doggy. That's one of my old late dogs I had when I was in college, grad school. Wonderful dog named Marley. He was a Cocker Spaniel. And in fact, the research that I'm about to talk about, I believe, was done with Cocker Spaniels. It was done with It was done with people who raise Cocker Spaniels, that breed Cocker Spaniels. Okay, that see Cocker Spaniels all the time and have to make very kind of fine, grain distinctions between them. It's like, okay, that's Marley the dog, that's Peter the dog, that's Rover the cocker. These are all Cocker Spaniels, and they're probably all part of the same litter. But people who raise these dogs and were around them all the time and have to describe them to people who might want to adopt them, whatever, have to know these subtle differences. If you're a dog breeder, in fact, you show some of these same inversion effects with dog images that you do with face images. Okay. And it's not just that. It's people who are bird watchers or have a collection or a group of birds from a specific family or something like that. They also it's thought to use the same sort of configural analysis that all of us do with faces. Dog breeders probably do with dogs. Bird breeders do with birds. Car designers show that sometimes with the fronts of cars, which is interesting. Yeah, they look like faces, but if you do this all the time, you get really good at this sort of thing. So it works. It works with other types of stimuli. So this idea, so I'm going to put a question mark here now, okay, whether this is specific to faces. It might not be completely specific to faces. It might be that this specialized kind of set of analyses that make us, better, so good with faces, is actually related more to having a perceptual expertise with a class of stimuli. Now, that expertise has to involve a number of things, as it turns out. It has to involve hours and hours trying to make distinctions between dogs. It also helps if you can say, all of these dogs kind of look more alike because they're associated with the same family than these dogs. So if you can kind of subtly identify maybe some of the kind of nuances in the face that are making someone can turn off their microphone. I'd appreciate it. I'm hearing somebody's microphone. Thank you. If you can kind of pick out family resemblance, whether it's in birds or dogs or even cars that have been designed, by the same company, that helps too. Okay, so the story about face specialty, that we have a special process just reserved for faces, has kind of evolved a little bit. And these specialized processes might really pertain more to classes of stimuli for which somebody has expertise. We all pretty much have expertise with faces, but some of us have expertise with dogs, with birds, with cars. I guess there's somebody's shown it with guitars. Cool, right? But that expertise has to take some time to develop, and it has to involve, the ability to make fine grained distinctions between them. Okay. that ends faces. Let's take a little break here and just stop for a second and see if there is questions. Aida asked this question. I learned that face inversion is hard to recognize with animals too. One of the experiments about Dalmatian experts that they couldn't recognize Dalmatians upside down. That's exactly it, Aida. So that you are absolutely right. I know you've been asking questions about this. It's a really interesting topic. I agree with it, and your interpretation is exactly right. Dalmatian breeders, other sorts of breeds as well. I don't know. Maybe some of you. I know some people sometimes. In Southern California, have families that breed dogs, and you know, you probably could just do a little test on your families that breed dogs and see if they show the inversion effect. Go ahead and take pictures of all the dogs. Say, okay, which one's this? Is this Marley? Is this Bob? Is this Peter? Da 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 da. When it's upright, and then show them upside down, they'll probably show the inversion effect. Would be really interesting. Let me know if you do that and it happens. Other questions at this point? Other questions? Okay, let me do a quick poll. Oh, God, these polls are what's really taking up a lot of time, but I know you want the questions, right? Okay. Okay. Okay, very easy one. I'm not going to even let you have a minute to answer this. When you see a smiling face, A, your emotions could be very slightly changed. B, you very subtly imitate that face with your own. C, your smile-related muscles are activated. Or D, all of the above. And I believe I fixed the sound. So while you're answering that, I'm going to play my Udo. Isn't that a cool sound? And here, if you're interested, is a talking drum. This one is from West Africa. I can't remember exactly where. Okay, time's up. Oh, you got this right. Everyone got this right. Almost everyone except for one person. That's okay. Yes. When you see a smiling face, your emotions could be very slightly changed. It's true, very slightly. Here, I'll share the results, sorry. You subtly imitate that face with your own. Absolutely true. One person said that was the correct answer, but these other two are true as well. Your smile-related muscles are activated. Absolutely true. So the correct answer is D. Everyone got that almost. Okay, great job. There's a question for you. Let's go ahead now and switch our topic. I know we only have a few minutes here, but I still want to get as much done as possible. Just take a second. And what I'm going to start talking about is one of my very favorite topics, which is imitation. Oh boy, I love this literature. We've done imitation research in my laboratory, the fact that I was able to write the book at the time led me to some really, really fascinating imitation research that I think you're going to find really interesting. Oh, shoot. Hold on. Just give me a second and find the imitation slides here. Oh, are they not here? Oh, boy. Okay, I guess I did not download them. That's okay. I'm good. I'm good. No one panic. So the fact is, we are always imitating each other. And this imitation is not something that we are typically consciously aware of. You might notice these things sometimes, like if you're at a party, you might find yourself taking on the body language of somebody else. One of the more conspicuous examples is if you're talking to somebody with a heavy foreign accent, you might find yourself kind of imitating that accent a little bit. And these are examples where you're kind of aware of your body, of your brain's kind of tendency to imitate. But the truth is that our imitation is happening all the time. It's not like the imitation you see the folks on Saturday Night Live doing, Alec Baldwin of Trump and all that sort of thing. It's not that sort of overt imitation. It's subtle little imitations that typically you don't notice, but your brain is using, your social situation is using, and your whole perceptual experience is using. And I think you're going to find this stuff really interesting. So yes, we are all imitating each other all the time. You've already learned a little bit about this. You learned about it with regard to imitating expressions, right? So, you know, a smile begets a smile, all right? It's contagious in a very subtle way. Again, this is a great example, the one that we've already talked about. It's a great example of the unconscious imitation that we're doing. But it really fits in here well. And as I said, it's also postures. Postures, what I mean is body language. You know, somebody crosses their arms at a party. When you're talking to them, you might find yourself doing that. The accent of somebody, that sort of thing. All terrific examples where we might be aware, but typically it happens without our awareness. Some of the early research that was done on this had to do with us, students imitating professors during office hours. So there'd be cameras set up in the professor's office, and the students knew about this. They didn't necessarily know what was being tested, but they would film the professor and the student as they talked with each other, and particularly kind of track the body language of each of them as it occurred. So it is kind of one of the first experiments, can't remember when this was done, in the 60s or 70s, one of the first experiments that was done on imitation of body language. And yes, that's what you found, that the students would start imitating the body language a little bit of the professor as they were interacting. So the professor crosses his arms or her arms, and the student would cross their arms. And this was a fairly consistent sort of thing. And again, it's not very overt. In most cases, after these students would come out of the offices, they would and be asked whether or not they realized they were imitating, they would say no. But they'd say, I can imagine I might have done that sort of thing. Doesn't seem that strange to them, but it typically didn't happen with any sort of conscious awareness. And what they found, and this is kind of a correlational sort of relationship, but what they found was that the more imitation occurred between the people, the better their rapport was self-rated to be. Okay, so, as the professor started to maybe stroke her chin as she was thinking of something, the student might do that as well. After the interaction, there'd be ratings on these videos. How often was there imitation? How often was there imitation? It turns out the more imitation there was, the more positive the professor and student would then independently rate their rapport in the relationship. Say, oh yeah, that student and I have a good rapport. Okay, that professor and I, yeah, that's one of the professors on campus I have a really nice rapport with, without knowing they were doing any of this imitation. So it could be, whether it facilitates the rapport or maybe is a result of having, a good relationship. Maybe it's something that helps. It could be both. It's unclear how that works, although there are ways of interestingly manipulating manipulating imitation to see how it might bear on rapport. Okay, so this is called the chameleon effect. And I probably should stop here, right? Yeah, I'll stop here. But the idea of a chameleon effect is like chameleons change their color depending on their context. People kind of change their postures depending on who they're interacting with. And we will talk about that in detail next class. See you later.